And I'm sitting there and in this deep, holy, reverent state. And I feel someone sit down in the chair next to me. And I'm like, oh my God, are you kidding me? And he is so close. And I'm starting to get kind of antsy because this person is, rubbing shoulders against me. I'm like, this is really uncomfortable for me.
Yeah.
So I open my eyes and it is Desmond Tutu.
No.
Yeah, sitting right next to me. And he just giggles and he laughs because he knows exactly what he's done,
of
right?
Course.
He knows that I was in this holier than thou state, and he was just gonna invade it.
I love that so much.
Isn't that great? And so I was like, oh my gosh, and he laughed. He I think he literally said, gotcha, didn't I?
Yeah.
And
First off, Ben, thank you so much for being here with us on Steal My Sermon.
thank you.
Why don't you share a little bit about kind of what you're doing in the world of ministry?
Okay. I am currently the school chaplain at TMI Episcopal, the diocesan Episcopal school in the Diocese of West Texas. And so that gives me this wonderful opportunity to get to preach at different parishes and different congregations, different ministry settings. I preach, of course, in the chapel setting at TMI, but right now I'm getting to help friends and supply and come in and just do guest preaching gigs, and so that's where I am right now.
Awesome. Okay, well, let's go ahead and dive in then.
Let's dive in.
Okay, so I'm Alex Holloway.
And I'm Ben Nelson.
And you are welcome to
Steal My Sermon.
Okay, so let's start. We're talking about Proper 28b,
Yes.
following All Saints.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought we'd go with track 1 because I liked the reading better, basically.
Yeah, sure.
So
sure.
let's talk about the Old Testament lesson, and then we'll get to the Gospel.
Mm-hmm.
So the Old Testament lesson comes from Samuel, and it's the story of Hannah, which, like most of the lectionary, you get, this tiny little piece, and you don't quite get the whole thing. Which I was actually thinking it's always possible to extend the readings a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
and in this case, I think I probably would extend it just until Hannah goes back to the temple and actually gives Samuel back to the temple to kind of close that loop. And because one of the directions you could preach was stewardship, I think you need to see that whole story rather than just the first part.
Yeah.
So anyway, the first thought I had when I was sitting down looking at these scriptures was how many people in the parish will be really familiar with the pain of infertility that Hannah's story brings. And so just sort of approaching preaching with a sensitivity to that and knowing that even if you haven't experienced it personally, that, it's probably going to be hitting some people hard out in the pews. And also will be not just hitting them hard, but will be something that's important in their spiritual journey as well.
Absolutely.
So, and I think a cool point you can kind of make with that is something I love about the Bible is it never shies away from the ugly, hardest parts of life. It's so not the cross-stitched pillow or the Instagram. It's reality, and I love that it's the Bible always shares the dark side of things too, and the people's vulnerability and their pain. So that's really what we see with Hannah. She's willing to be totally honest and bring to God her whole broken self. She's comes to the temple weeping. She won't eat. She's just really being honest in her prayer to God. So, any thoughts on Hannah?
Yeah, as you were touching on the grief of infertility and the grief of loss and pain, I had someone say to me recently, we were talking about grief and the way that grief shows up in our daily lives, and one of the takeaways for me was how important it is for us as preachers to to be able to name it as stewards. You know, you're going to hear a lot of my conversation with the gospel around stewardship.
Sure.
And to me, part of stewardship is owning all that is, including the grief. And what I know about grief, and I'm sure what is true all over the place about grief, is that grief is grief is grief is grief, right? And it if we'll allow ourselves to touch those painful places, we can find the good news in the midst of it, and the vulnerability of Hannah to say, you know, why aren't you eating? Why are you weeping? You know, that painful prayer that all of us have had, is to be a good steward of the grief we encounter, so that we can also be a better steward of the joy that we encounter in the wholeness and in the healing. And not to rush to that, but that's one of the things that, with that Hannah story, that I keep thinking about, is to be able to own both sides of that equation. You know, I almost said, you know, the good, you take the good and you take the bad, and then I started hearing the Facts of Life song in my head. But
that'll be in my head now. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome, and feel free to the gospel according to Mrs. Garrett.
That's right.
But you know, to be able to kind of tackle from the truth of pain is I think part of the power of a story like Hannah's story.
Absolutely.
You know?
Yeah. Yeah, because if you numb yourself to the pain, then you're also numbing yourself to the joy that comes later.
Yeah.
So it's the hardest, one of the hardest parts of life.
I had a great encounter with a mentor once, and the phrase that she kept saying was, "You can never heal what you don't feel."
That's good.
Isn't that a good? That's like just a great. I mean, you could preach a whole sermon, and you know, maybe the Hannah sermon is the sermon, right? What you don't feel, you can't heal. And even when it's something that, like infertility, that you don't say in polite, you know, company. I mean, and you know, I think about all the women and men for that matter too. But the people in our lives and our congregations that deal with infertility or miscarriage or all those painful things that we don't name. And what a grace it would be to be able to name them in a sermon.
Yeah, exactly. And hearing something like that, even just said out loud from the pulpit, can be really healing in and of itself.
So
I think, you know.
So healing. I mean, just that a preacher can acknowledge oh, that's my story. You know, the most powerful words in the English language are me too, and you know, I've been down that road, or I don't know what that's like to go down that road, but I'm so, you know, Hannah, I don't know what you felt, but I'm so grateful that story's there for me. You know? That's a pretty beautiful sentiment.
Yeah, that's something I picked up on as well, was once we were able to sort of speak our pain, or someone else is able to speak it with us, we're no longer alone in it. I think that's what makes suffering unbearable, is not only are we suffering, whether it's infertility or sickness or loss, whatever it is, but we also feel isolated from others. You know, no one understands what I'm going through, no one gets me, you know, or even some kind of shame, like this is somehow my fault, or what did I do to deserve this? You know, I can imagine Hannah, how come my fellow wife has all these children and I didn't? What's wrong with me? You know, and that shame and that isolation is what makes suffering horrible. But as soon as we connect with someone else, connect with God, and like you said, that Me Too feeling, then that suffering can be transformed and can be redemptive, I think.
Oh, absolutely. I think a lot of our work as preachers is to shine a light on shame. You know, this is just another great example of a place. I mean, you know, we know that shame, which is that nagging sense that I don't belong, or I'm not worthy of love or connection or whatever, but that sense that just gnaws away at you. We know that that's untrue, right? Like we know, and yet we still feel it. I mean, we also know that shame is completely universal. That you have felt shame, I have felt shame. We all have felt And the more honest we are about that particular universal truth, the more we can shine that bright light of, well, you are loved, despite that feeling, and,
Right.
and even if you don't believe it, I can believe it with you and hold your hand in it, and I do think when we shine the light on shame, it's I heard it described once as that sense of shame and disconnection, the dis-ease of disconnection is like a petri dish with bacteria growing in it. And as soon as you shine, as you name it and shine the light on it, it immediately stops growing. And I thought that was a kind of a helpful image for me, just that the toxic mold that is present in those kind of thoughts.
Yeah. Eric always says sunshine is the best disinfectant.
Oh, yeah.
I love that.
I love that,
Yeah.
for sure. Yeah, I get that wholeheartedly. Yeah.
Kind of reminds me, in seminary we were studying 2 Corinthians, and our professor, I can't remember which chapter it is in 2 Corinthians, but Paul lists out, we've been shipwrecked, beaten, starved, all these horrendous experiences. And she called it an unresume. Jane Patterson, our professor, called it an unresume. And we had to sort of write our own unresumes.
Yeah.
So, you think on a resume you write, I was an amazing student and I did this. But an unresume is like, I have been through divorce, I'm, in recovery from addiction, or like whatever it is, those kind of ugly, dark places you don't want to tell people, but that actually have made you who you are, and that God has used to bring about more love in your life than you could ever imagine.
Yeah, the brilliance, I go back to the notion of 12-step recovery. The brilliance to me in 12-step recovery is that there's a deep, deep self-awareness that is not lonely. It's not me figuring out me. It's me figuring out me with the help of people who've been there before. And, my friends and acquaintances in certain types of recovery will tell me that, they shared their deepest, darkest secrets with another human being and with their higher power. And in that moment, they realized that their deepest, darkest secrets weren't that bad.
Yeah.
And even if they were forgivable and lovable.
I picked up, do you know Janet Davis? She's a spiritual director in Austin.
I don't.
She's one of my spiritual director, is my spiritual director. She's amazing. But this is one of her books. And this book, The Feminine Soul, goes through different, basically all the stories of women in the Bible and gives some really solid insight. So I was reading that, and something that she pointed out is you can see a transformation in Hannah that actually occurs before she gets pregnant. So when we start the story, she's bereft, she's not eating, she's not speaking, she's weeping. And then it says that she goes to the temple by herself and she pours out her heart to God, and she talks to Eli the priest. And then it says she rose, so she goes from, kind of slumped over, she rises up, and then it says her countenance was no longer sad, something like that. And then she gets pregnant. And so what's interesting about that is, or what Janet points out, is she wanted a child, and not to minimize her real desire for a child, but the pain, like the deeper pain she was feeling, was that she felt forgotten by God. And so once she felt seen by God in her moment of prayer, it lifted her spirit, and then the child that she did end up having was a sign of God's love and remembrance of her. So I thought that was cool, because as we know, as we're talking about grief and shame, it doesn't always work out.
That's right.
You could pray for a long time for something and you may not get it. But one angle I think pastorally we could take is, how can we be sure that God loves us, sees us, has not forgotten us in our suffering, even if it doesn't work out exactly how we would like or how we would plan?
Yeah, well, I love this notion of the gospel of failure. That things that we deem to be complete failures in life are usually the place where God's love becomes known to us.
Mhm.
I spent a lot of time working with people in 12-step recovery or recovery from addiction, or families that have struggled with addiction in their households, and one of the deepest and most beautiful truths is that when we get to a place in our life where we're able to completely surrender to this notion of this is what it is,
Mhm.
and nothing I can do will cure it or control it or change it, but I can accept it for what it is, and that the presence of God is still there. To me, in the life of recovery, and for people I know and love in that world, that's where the miracle happens. It's not necessarily where, sobriety or emotional sobriety or all of a sudden everything's hunky-dory.
Mhm.
It's that you get to a place where you're like, oh yeah, I am okay, and I am loved, and I am beloved,
Mhm.
and that doesn't require a positive success. The prayer I love in the prayer book for us is the prayer for young people. Allow them to take failure not as a measure of their worth, but as a chance for a new start.
Mhm.
And that we keep getting to live that life of when things don't go our way. Well, okay, God's still there, and we're still there.
Right.
So I don't know. I find that tremendously helpful in understanding my own relation. That's personal too, by the way. I mean, that's
Sure,
deeply
yeah.
personal
Mhm.
to know that things don't have to be. They don't have to be overwhelmingly positive for things to be okay,
Right.
and for there to be joy present, and
Right.
and for healing to occur.
Right.
So,
And I think that's what Jesus on the cross exemplifies more than
Absolutely.
anything.
Absolutely.
It's like the least okay situation,
Right.
and it's making everything okay.
Yeah.
And I just always find such comfort, even though it's it's a distressing image, but such comfort in the image of Jesus on the cross, because you know that you can't go through anything that Jesus hasn't gone through already.
Yeah.
You're never.
Yeah.
He's never out of his depth when it comes to human suffering or experience.
Yeah, but the connection to me is that God in these conversations we have with Hannah, and with of course the gospel of Jesus and the passion of Jesus, when the conversation that God keeps having with us is that I know, right? I get it. You're experiencing this. I get it.
Mm-hmm.
We've been down this road before. We will go down this road again. And there's something tremendously comforting to when we kind of enter into that "Thy kingdom come, Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven," is that does include things going horribly off the rails, or things not going the way that we want them to go, or
Right.
I don't know why that I find that to be one of the most positive things about the gospel experience.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
It's not all balloons and roses.
Yeah, and that actually gets us right into our gospel.
Yeah,
thank
nice
you, Ben.
segue.
Good job.
Right.
But yeah, that was kind of my main impression of the gospel, was Jesus saying, this is, crazy things are going to happen. This is not going to be easy. But he's kind of unshaken by that, and encouraging his disciples to be unshaken. It's like, it'll be okay. You know. So jumping into Mark 13 a little bit, what kind of struck you or stood out to you about that passage?
Well, the stones. When he's talking about, look at these great big stones. There's a visual to me of I've gotten to go to the Holy Land a few times, and when you're there on the Temple Mount, or more appropriately when you're kind of below the Temple Mount, you see these great big 1st century stones that are tumbled all over the place. They look like they look like Legos that somebody's left on the floor, and there's a real poignancy to imagining how big that temple would have been, and then how much rubble. And we really only have like a little tiny little bit, right, archaeologically speaking, of that. And to read this passage and to think about, imagine the disciples who heard that, they couldn't have imagined this thing being stomped into the ground.
Right.
There's so many things like that I just think, the Alamo Dome will always be there, and
Right.
and that's not the way the world works, right? And so for Jesus to be able to say, look around you, this stuff is really not gonna last, and to do so in a way that, to me, I think, kind of to your point, is acceptance in the most beautiful way. Look, it's 'twas always thus, and thus shall always be, and then and you'll be okay. Buildings will rise, buildings will fall, but you'll be okay. To me, so the entry point for me is that this particular week I'm preaching a stewardship sermon. My understanding of stewardship is that we're just holding on to something until the next generation, and we don't get a say in what happens to it afterwards. My favorite expression, my dad used to say, never seen a hearse pulling a U-Haul, and it seems kind of trite to say, you can't take it with you, but I think the point in stewardship is that you can't take it with you, and more importantly, you are caring for it for someone else. So all of these resources that we have, which are vast as Episcopalians, we have these vast resources that we're entrusted with carrying for whatever will be in the next generation. And I think if there's anything that the last 22 months have taught us, it's that impermanence is a real thing.
Yeah.
And that,
Yeah.
and that we don't know what's around the corner. So we have a responsibility to hold these tensions lightly, so that when things fall apart, we can still hold. And even if it's not me, even if I'm not here, the legacy of love and acceptance and peace and joy and shalom and all these things that we carry with us will maintain. And we don't know what that'll look like from generation to generation, because we're not in charge. I don't know if that really is a good stewardship sermon or not.
Yeah, no, I love that. It reminds me of just thinking about, anytime you lose a parishioner in the church, you think, like, you go back and say, oh, they led the Brotherhood of St. Andrew, and they were there when we, built the new sanctuary, and they really spearheaded all that kind of stuff. And, it's amazing to me the love that goes into those seemingly small and kind of annoying tasks, vestry meetings and building committee and, all the kind of tedious stuff, but people really do. The reason they do that is because they care about the children who will one day, go to Sunday school in that room, and I find that touching, I think.
Coming off the heels of All Saints Day and All Souls Day, you can just, it's those just those mile markers of beautiful people along the way that stewarded us. I don't know, is that a word? Stewarded us and shepherded. I'm getting worse here, but they just brought us along, and some are living, some are not, and the great legacy is that their stones don't remain, but their love does, and their gosh, it's such a powerful image to me to imagine the stones that do fall are just rocks, But the stones that last, the building that lasts, or the church that lasts is the people who. And then if we look at the history of the people, the saints and the stories tellers and the gift givers along the way, that what they have stewarded to us is that same legacy of love, which is stronger than any temple, stronger than any facade. It's more real than anything we can see, taste, touch, or smell.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very sacramental. It's a very sacramental notion, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, stewardship is a sacrament. It's an
Mm-hmm.
outward and visible sign
Yeah.
of a beautiful inward and spiritual gift. And
Yeah. I think if I were gonna preach, because I'm more focused on Hannah's story today, I think you could preach stewardship from Hannah as well, because she, for years, wants a child, prays fervently, finally has a child, and then what does she do?
Yeah.
Gives him away.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you mentioned holding things loosely, and I think that's she's such a model of that. She recognizes that this child is a gift from God, and
Yes.
to God it goes.
Yeah. Well, and look at all the many ways throughout the story of God's people that the women are the ones that remind us of that over and over again. Hannah, I would say Mary. I mean,
Yeah.
The widow's mite, of course, is a whole other kettle of fish. But just over and over again, there's this level of just sacrificial giving. And we complain about a pledge card.
Right. Yeah.
Hannah is willing to give up everything.
Yes. Yeah.
Just period.
Right. Yeah, and that takes me back to Jesus' words. If you want to save your life, you must
You
lose
gotta
it.
lose it.
And
Yeah.
it's so hard, and it's so paradoxical and counterintuitive. But at the second you surrender,
Mm-hmm.
that's when you actually get everything back.
Yeah.
I think the only other thought that came up for me with this gospel is thinking about how can we. So Jesus is standing on the beautiful temple grounds and saying this will be rubble.
Mm-hmm.
We know that this life of being a Christian is going to be hard. Jesus never pretends like it's going to be easy. He says you'll be persecuted. There will be earthquakes. There are all going to be all these things. So how do we train or kind of prepare ourselves as Christians for the suffering that we've already known and that will continue to happen, while also holding on to the joy of the Christian life? Reminds me of Desmond Tutu. Like, if I'm thinking of joy, I go straight to Archbishop Desmond
For
Tutu.
sure.
I mean, he dances.
Exudes it.
If he's giving a lecture, he
Yeah.
he's funny and he's laughing and so you could be tempted to say oh, he probably doesn't take anything seriously and had an easy life.
Yeah.
And we all know
Right.
absolutely
That's not true.
He's seen horrors and walked with South Africa through the hardest thing they've ever been through.
Yeah.
So I look to people like that, and it seems like the people who really get it, who give their whole lives to the gospel, they have that sense of unshakability, and I envy that. I aim for it, because it's it seems like they're so secure in God's love that even not that they don't experience hard things, but it's it can't shake their core. And that's well, thank you so much, Ben. It's been really
It's been a joy.
awesome to get to talk to you, and best of luck preaching, and hope you have a very joyful Sunday.
I know I will.
All right.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks.